The way that the human ear is described in anatomical terms, we view the ear as being three different regions. These regions consist of the outer external ear, that's the pinna, the part that we can all see. And I apologize, my ears are remarkably small. I don't know why they're so small. So, not the best example, but that's the outer ear. Within the outer ear, there's mechanisms and different anatomical aspects, of course. There's also going in, traveling deep, there's the middle ear, which the middle ear is exactly what it sounds like. It's the middle part of the ear between the outer ear and the inner ear. And we're going to dive into the more intricate details of this here momentarily, but this is just elaborating on the basic regions here. Then we have the inner ear, which that consists of the bony labyrinth, at which also beautiful rendering of a self-portrait which I made, complete with yarmulke. And this is primarily to establish some landmarks, some key anatomical landmarks of the outer ear. We can see here this area, and I apologize, my ears are tiny, so probably tough to see, but you have the cartilage. Then traveling on the screen left to that, we can see the helix. And perhaps it could be, if you're trying to really conceptualize this and get it down, or as you know, a memorization to learn, you could perhaps even touch those parts of your ear while reviewing this. Then towards the inner ear, we have the antihelix. Below that, in this main part right here, that region, that's the pinna. Then going in to where this part is, that's called the concha, with a CHA in it. And then we have the auditory bulla. Within the outer external ear anatomy, we have the auricle, the external auditory canal, and the tympanic membrane. And the tympanic membrane is a very key anatomical region because it's what separates the outer ear from the middle ear, for one. But the tympanic membrane, or eardrum, is a thin, semi-transparent partition between the external auditory canal and the middle ear. It attaches by a fibrocartilaginous ring to the temporal bone here on the side of your skull at the base of the external acoustic meatus, which that's just a little tiny bone region, like right in there, and stretches across the opening as a three-layered window from outside to inside. The three layers are a covering of epidermis and the middle layer of dense connective tissue linking the collagen, elastic fibers, and fibroblasts. The lining of a simple cuboidal epithelium, the tympanic membrane is somewhat convex toward the middle ear cavity, within the apex forming the umbo. Attached along the superior inner surface of the tympanic membrane to the umbo is the first middle ear ossicle, the malleus. And the function of the tympanic membrane, to put it into very quick and easy to understand terms, is whenever we have like a busted eardrum, that's when there is a perforation there, and that is noticeable, that the sound propagation now traveling to our ears is perceived as being much louder, much more intense. So that dampening mechanism of the eardrum is what allows the decibel level to be at a region that is more readily accepted by the continuing inner anatomical aspects of the ear as we go on. The middle ear is a small air-filled cavity in the petrous portion of the temporal bone that is lined by epithelium. It's separated from the external ear and by the tympanic membrane and from the internal ear by a thin bony partition that contains two small membrane-covered openings, which are the oval window and the round window. Now, extending across the middle ear and attached to it by ligaments of the three smallest bones in the body, which are collectively referred to as the auditory ossicles, which these are connected to one another by synovial joints. The bones named for their shapes are the malleus, incus, and stapes, sometimes referred to as the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. So the handle of the malleus attaches to the internal surface of the tympanic membrane. The head of the malleus articulates within the body of the incus. The incus, the middle bone in the series, articulates with the head of the stapes. The base or foot of the stapes fits into the oval window. Directly below the oval window is another opening, the round window, which is enclosed by a membrane called the secondary tympanic membrane. Two tiny skeletal muscles also attach to the ossicles. The tensor tympani muscle, which is innervated by the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve, and this limits movement and increases tension on the eardrum to prevent damage to the inner ear from loud noises. The stapedius muscle, which is innervated by the facial nerve, is the smallest of all skeletal muscles. By defining the large vibrations of the stapes due to loud noise, it protects the oval window, but it also decreases the sensitivity of hearing. For this reason, paralysis of the stapedius muscle is associated with hyperacusis from abnormally sensitive hearing. Because it takes a fraction of a second before the tensor tympani and stapedius muscles to contract, they can protect the inner ear from prolonged loud noises such as thunder, but not from a brief loud noise such as a gunshot. The interior wall of the middle ear contains an opening that leads directly into the auditory or pharyngotympanic tube, commonly known as the eustachian tube. The auditory tube, which consists of both bone and elastic cartilage, connects the middle ear within the nasopharynx or the superior portion of the throat. It is normally closed at its medial or pharyngeal end. During swallowing or yawning, it opens, allowing air to enter or leave the middle ear until the pressure in the middle ear equals the atmosphere pressure. So commonly referred to as like popping your ears, right? The pressures are balanced. The tympanic membrane vibrates freely as the sound waves strike it. If the pressure is not equalized, it can result in intense pain, even hearing impairment or ringing in the ears. Vertigo can also develop. And the auditory tube is also a route by which pathogens may travel from the nose to the throat to the middle ear, which this can cause a lot of common ear infections. The internal ear is also called the labyrinth because of its complicated series of canals. Structurally, it consists of two main divisions, an outer bony labyrinth that encloses an inner membranous labyrinth. The bony labyrinth has a series of cavities in the petrous part of the temporal bone, which is divided into three areas. These areas are 1, the semicircular canals, 2, the vestibule, and 3, the cochlea. The bony labyrinth is lined with periosteum that contains perilymph, a chemical that is somewhat similar to cerebral spinal fluid. Although few people are totally unable to hear, many people have enough impairment to prevent speech comprehension. The two categories of hearing loss are conductive deafness and nerve deafness. Diseases, infections, or tumorous bone growth can prevent the middle ear from transmitting waves properly to the cochlea. The result is that conductive deafness or middle ear deafness is sometimes temporary. If it persists, it can be corrected by surgery or by hearing aids that amplify sounds. Because people with conductive deafness have a normal cochlea and auditory nerve, they readily hear their own voices, conducted it through the bones of the skull directly to the cochlea by passing in the middle ear. Because they hear themselves clearly, they may accuse others of mumbling or talking too softly. talking too softly. Nerve deafness, on the other hand, or inner ear deafness, results from damage to the cochlea, the hair cells, or the auditory nerve. If it is confined to one part of the cochlea, it impairs hearing of a certain frequencies and not others. Nerve deafness can be inherited. It can result from disease, or it can result from exposure to loud noises. For example, many soldiers, construction workers, and fans of loud rock music expose themselves to noise levels that damage the synapses and neurons of the auditory system. Gradually, they begin to notice ringing in the ears or impaired hearing. Tinnitus is frequent or constant ringing in the ears. In some cases, tinnitus may be due to a phenomenon similar to phantom limb. Damage to part of the cochlea is like an amputation. The brain no longer gets its normal input. Axons representing other parts of the body may invade part of the brain area that usually responds to sound. In many cases, people who have lost their hearing in a particular range report ringing in the ears in the same range, suggesting that some other input is activating part of the auditory cortex. However, many people often do not recognize a hearing problem until it is brought to their attention by a relative or a friend. Symptoms can include an inability to hear or distinguish some or all sounds in one or both ears, difficulty understanding conversation when many people are talking in the background, a need to turn up the volume on the television or radio louder than other people find comfortable. Hearing problems are sometimes accompanied by dizziness, earache, discharge or bleeding from the ear, ringing noises in the ear, or in rare cases, weakness, facial muscles. Believe it or not, telepathy is now the subject of intense research at universities around the world, where scientists have already been able to use advanced sensors to read individual words, images, and thoughts in a person's brain. This could alter the way we communicate with stroke and accident victims who are locked in their bodies, unable to articulate their thoughts except through blinks. But that's just the start. Telepathy might also radically change the way we interact with computers and the outside world. Now, true telepathy, founded in science fiction and fantasy novels, is not possible without outside assistance. As we know, the brain is electrical. In general, anytime an electron is accelerated, it gives off electromagnetic radiation. The same holds true for electrons oscillating inside the brain, which broadcasts radio waves. But these signals are too faint to be detected by others, and even if we could perceive these radio waves, it would be difficult to make sense of them. It should be noted, though, that scientists have been able to get crude approximations of a person's thoughts using EEG scans. Subjects would put on a helmet with EEG sensors and concentrate on certain pictures, say the image of a car. The EEG signals were then recorded for each image, and eventually a rudimentary dictionary of thought was created with one-to-one correspondence between a person's thoughts and the EEG. Dr. Brian Pasley and his colleagues are literally reading thoughts, at least in principle. One of the postdocs there, Dr. Sarah Sezespansky, explains how they are able to identify words inside the mind. The scientists used what is called ECOG, electrocardiogram technology, which is a vast improvement over the jumble of signals that EEG scans produce. ECOG or ECOG scans are unprecedented in accuracy and resolution. Since signals are directly recorded from the brain and do not pass through the skull, the flip side is that one has to remove a portion of the skull to place a mesh containing 64 electrodes in an 8x8 grid directly on top of the exposed brain. The year was 1730, and Francis Moore, an Englishman by nationality, was sailing eastward up the Gambia River. When he came upon men and women carrying drums, carved wood as much as a yard long, tapered from top to bottom He noted that women danced briskly to their music, and sometimes with the drums were beats on approach of an enemy, and finally, on some very extraordinary occasions, that the drums summoned help from neighboring towns. It would be a century later that Captain William Allen, on an expedition to the Niger River, made a further discovery. By virtue of paying attention to his Cameroon pilot, whom he called Glasgow, they were in the cabin of the iron paddle ship when, as Allen recalled, suddenly he became totally abstracted and remained for a while in the attitude of listening. Period. On being taxed with attention, he said, "You know, hear my son speak." As we have heard no voice, he was asked how he knew it. He said, "Drums speak. Tell me come up." Damage to an area of the brain that's just above and behind the left ear, this region being designated as Wernicke's area, causes difficulty in understanding spoken language. Damage to a region at the very top of the head, the motor cortex, causes difficulty moving your fingers. Damage to an area in the center of the brain, the hippocampal complex, can block the ability to form new memories while leaving old memories intact. Damage to an area just behind your forehead can cause dramatic changes in personality. It can rob aspects of you from you. Such localization of mental function is a strong scientific argument for the involvement of the brain and thought, and the thesis that thoughts come from the brain. Our brains are exquisitely sensitive to timing information. We're able to localize objects in the world based on the differences of only a few milliseconds between the time of arrival of a sound at one of our ears versus the other. Music then can be thought of as a type of perceptual illusion in which our brain imposes structure and order on a sequence of sounds. Musical activity involves nearly every region of the brain that we know about, and nearly every neural subsystem. Different aspects of the music are handled by different neural regions, and the brain uses functional segregation for music processing and employs a system of feature detectors whose job it is to analyze specific aspects of the musical signal, such as pitch, tempo, timbre, and so on. Some of the music processing has points in common with the operations required to analyze other sounds. Understanding speech, for example, requires that we segment a flurry of sounds into words, sentences, and phrases, and that we be able to understand aspects beyond the words, such as sarcasm. Several different dimensions of a musical sound need to be analyzed, usually involving several quasi-independent neural processes, and they need to be brought together to form a coherent representation of what we're listening to. The brain faces three difficulties in trying to identify the auditory objects we hear. First, the information arriving at the sensory receptors is undifferentiated. Second, the information is ambiguous. Different objects can give rise to similar or identical patterns of activation on the eardrum. Third, the information is seldom complete. Parts of the sound may be covered up by other sounds or lost. The brain has to make a calculated guess about what is really out there. It does so very quickly and generally subconsciously. Our brain can estimate the size of an enclosed space on the basis of the reverberation and echo present in the signal that hits our ears. We as humans tend to be under the illusion that we simply open our eyes and we see. A bird chirps outside the window and we instantly hear. Sensory perception creates mental images in our minds, representations of the world outside our heads, so quickly and seamlessly that it seems there is nothing to it. This is an illusion. Our perceptions are the end product of a long chain of neural events that give us the illusion of an instantaneous image. We interact with the world around us through senses. As John Locke noted, everything we know about the world is through what we see, hear, smell, touch, or taste. We naturally assume that the world is just as we perceive it to be, but experiments have forced us to confront the reality that this is not the case. Why does it do this? Why does our brain act this way? Our best guess is that it was evolutionarily adapted to do so. Much of what we see and hear contains missing information. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors might have seen a tiger partially hidden by trees, or heard a lion or partially obscured the sound of leaves rustling much closer to us. Sounds and sights often come to us as partial information that has been obscured by other things in the environment. So what exactly was the sapiens, our ancestors' secret of success? How did we manage to settle so rapidly in so many distant and ecologically different habitats? How did we push all of the human species into oblivion? Why couldn't even the strong, brainy, cold-proof the intervals survive our onslaught? The debate continues to rage. The most likely answer is in the very thing that makes the debate possible. Homo sapiens conquered the world thanks above all to its unique language. The appearance of new ways of thinking and communicating between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago constitutes the cognitive revolution. What caused it? We're not sure. The most commonly believed theory argues that accidental genetic mutations changed the inner wiring of the brains of sapiens, enabling them to think in unprecedented ways and to communicate using an altogether new type of language. In the wake of the cognitive revolution, gossip helped Homo sapiens to form larger and more stable bands. But even gossip has its limits. Sociological research has shown that the maximum natural size of a group bonded by gossip is about 150 individuals. Most people can either intimately know nor gossip effectively about more than 150 human beings. How did Homo sapiens manage to cross this critical threshold, eventually founding cities comprising tens of thousands of inhabitants and empires ruling hundreds of millions? The secret was probably the appearance of fiction, large numbers of strangers cooperating successfully by believing in common myths. Sensory information from the various modalities, such as the eyes, ears, and skin, courses into the brain, reaching the appropriate cortical region, visual cortex, auditory cortex, tactile cortex. For processing period, for example, the visual cortex would engage layers and layers of neurons to turn pixels of retinal stimulation into recognizable images before it can scream into the amygdala, "It's a gun." Importantly, some sensory information entering the brain takes a shortcut, bypassing the cortex and going directly to the amygdala. Thus, the amygdala can be informed about something scary before the cortex has a clue. Moreover, thanks to the extreme excitability of this pathway, the amygdala can respond to stimuli that are too fleeting or faint for the cortex to note. Additionally, these shortcut projections from stronger, more excitable synapses in the BLA than do the ones from the sensory cortex. Emotional arousal enhances fear conditioning through this pathway. This shortcut's power is shown in the case of a man with stroke damage to his visual cortex, producing cortical blindness. While unable to process most visual information, he still recognized emotional facial expressions via the shortcut. Crucially, while sensory information reaches the amygdala rapidly by this shortcut, it isn't terribly accurate, since after all, accuracy is what the cortex supplies. The first frontal patient, the famous Phineas Gage, was identified in 1848 in Vermont. Gage, the foreman of a railroad construction crew, was injured when an accident with blasting powder blew a 13-pound iron tamping rod to the left side of his face and about the top front of his skull. It landed 80 feet away, along with much of his left frontal cortex. Remarkably, he survived and recovered his health. But the respected, even healed Gage was transformed. In the words of the doctor who followed him over the years, the equilibrium or balance, so to speak, between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities seemed to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little difference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times pertinaciously obstinate, yet capricious and vacillating, devising many plans of future operations which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned in turn for other appearing more feasible. Gage was described by friends as no longer Gage. He wasn't capable of resuming his job and was reduced to appearing as an exhibit displayed by P.T. Barnum. Symbols that correspond to the external world are internal representations of external reality. Abstract symbols may stand in correspondence to things in the world independent of their peculiar properties of any organisms. Since the human mind makes use of internal representations of external reality, the mind is a mirror of nature, and correct reason mirrors the logic of the external world. Reason is the mechanical manipulation of abstract symbols, which are meaningless in themselves, but can be given meaning by virtue of their capacity to refer to the things either in the actual world or in possible states of the world. Without concepts, you'd experience a world of ever-fluctuating noise. Everything you ever encountered would be unlike everything else. You'd be experientially blind. You'd be incapable of learning. Everything you perceive around you is represented by concepts in your brain. Take a look at any object near you. Then look slightly to the left of the object. You just accomplished something remarkable without even knowing it. Your head and eye movements seemed inconsequential, but caused a gigantic change in the visual input reaching your brain. If you think of your field of vision as a big TV screen, then your slight eye movement just changed millions of pixels on that screen. And yet, you did not experience blurry streaks across your visual field. That's because you don't see the world in terms of pixels. You see objects, and they changed very little as you moved your eyes. You perceive low-level regularities like linens, contours, streaks, and blurs, as well as higher-level regularities like complex objects and scenes. Your brain learned these regularities as concepts long ago, and it uses those concepts now to categorize your continually changing visual input. Objectivism has dominated Western culture, and in particular Western philosophy, from the pre-Socratics to the present day. The view that we have access to absolute and unconditional truths about the world is the cornerstone of the Western philosophical tradition. The myth of objectivity has flourished in both the rationalists and empiricist traditions, which in this respect differ only in their accounts of how we arrive at such absolute truths. For the rationalists, only our innate capacity to reason can give us knowledge of things as they really are. For the empiricists, all our knowledge of the world arises from our senses' perceptions, either directly or indirectly, and is constructed out of the elements of sensation. Human speech is continuous, a stream of sound, yet when you listen to your native language, you hear discrete words. How does that happen? Once again, you use concepts to categorize the continuous input. Beginning in infancy, you learn regularities in the stream of speech that reveal the boundaries between phonemes, the smallest bits of sound that you can distinguish in a language. These regularities become concepts that your brain later uses to categorize a stream of sound into syllables. All sensory information is massive, constantly changing puzzle for your brain to solve. The objects you see, the sounds you hear, the odors you smell, the touches you feel, the flavors you taste, and the interoceptive sensations you experience as aches and pains and affect, they all involve continuous sensory signals that are highly variable and ambiguous as they reach your brain. Your brain's job is to predict them before they arrive, fill in missing details, and find regularities where possible, so that you experience a world of objects, people, music, and events, not the blooming, buzzing confusion that is really out there. To achieve this magnificent feat, your brain employs concepts to make the sensory signals meaningful, creating an explanation for where they came from, what they refer to in the world, and how to act on them. Your perceptions are so vivid and immediate that they compel you to believe that your experience of the world is as it is when you actually experience a world of your own construction. The following is a representative list of these assumptions about language, meaning, truth, and understanding. Not all objectivist philosophers in linguistics accept all of them, but the most influential figures seem to accept most of them. Truth is a matter of fitting words to the world. A theory of meaning for natural language is based on a theory of truth, independent of the way people understand and use language. Meaning is objective and disembodied, independent of human understanding. Sentences are abstract objects with inherent structures. The meaning of these sentences can be obtained from the meanings of its parts and the structure of the sentence. Communication is a matter of a speaker's transmitting a message with a fixed meaning to a hearer. However, Lakoff and Johnson argue on the basis of linguistic evidence, especially metaphor, that objectivist philosophy fails to account for the way we understand our experience, our thoughts, and our language. An adequate account, we argue, requires viewing objects only as entities relative to our interactions with the world and our projections on it, viewing properties as interactional rather than inherent, viewing categories as experiential gestalts defined via prototype instead of viewing them as rigidly fixed and defined via set theory. Mozart died in 1791, but 202 years later, Mozart became the focus of a craze. It started with a brief letter published in the respected scientific journal Nature. The letter claimed that listening to a particular Mozart sonata for 10 minutes temporarily increased IQ by 8 points. 8 points is about half a standard deviation, quite a large effect for a mere 10-minute intervention. Intelligence researchers recognized immediately that this sounded too good to be true. It was not true, but amazingly, it took to dampen popular enthusiasm after a critical review. According to an article in the New York Times, January 15, 1998, Governor Zell Miller of Georgia proposed spending $105,000 a year from the state budget to purchase classical music tapes or CDs for the approximately 100,000 children born in Georgia each year. During his budget address to lawmakers, the governor played part of Beethoven's Ode to Joy and asked, "Now don't you feel smarter already?" He also remarked that from his experience growing up, musicians were folks that not only could play a fiddle, but they also were good mechanics. The article also quoted a skeptic. "I'm familiar with those findings. At the moment," said Sandra Trehab, a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, who studies infants' perception of music. "I don't think we have the evidence to make that statement unambiguously. If we really think you can swallow a pill, come up by a record or a particular book, or have any one experience, and that's going to be the thing that gets you into Harvard or Princeton, then that's an illusion." The Mozart effect should be a cautionary tale for any researcher who claims dramatic increases in IQ after an intervention. Whoever the peer reviewers were for Nature, they apparently were unaware that treating the three different reasoning tests as equal measures of abstract reasoning, based on the fact they were correlated to each other, was a terrible psychometric procedure. They also failed to require information about the participants with respect to IQ or musical experience and ability. And most distressing, the translation of individual test scores to spatial IQ scores and the claim of an 8-point increase was psychometrically naive. Fillmore has hypothesized that the meaning of all words are characterized in terms of frames, a hypothesis that has held up for over 30 years. In recent years, neural computational models of frames have been constructed in the Neural Theory of Language (NTL) group at the International Computer Science Institute (ICSI) at Berkeley. The grammar and the lexicon are characterized in NTL theory in terms of what are called constructions, neural circuitry linking speech and writing science to meanings, that is, frames, metaphors, and so on, which activate mental simulations. The mental simulations carry out inferences. The result is a collection of neural computational models of words, grammar, language understanding, and language acquisition. Vittorio Galis is one of the original discoverers of mirror neurons. He and Lakoff, working together in 2002, discovered something startling in going through primary mirror neuron data. All the information needed for the frame structure characterizing the concept of grasping can be found in the mirror neurons governing the action of perception of grasping. In other words, a conceptual structure for physical action exists in the neural system governing bodily movements by the visual perception of those movements. It was evident that the most basic concepts characterized in frames could be physically embodied at the level of mirror neurons. It is hard to underestimate how far the idea that concepts are physically embodied using the sensory motor system of the brain is from disembodied Enlightenment reason, from the usual view of concepts as disembodied abstractions entirely separate from the sensory motor system. The relationship between wavelength and speed, which is called the Doppler Effect, is an everyday experience. Listen to a car passing on the road. As the car is approaching, its engine sounds at a higher pitch, corresponding to a shorter wavelength and higher frequency of sound waves. And when it passes and goes away, this sounds at a lower pitch. The behavior of light or radio waves are similar. Indeed, the police make use of the Doppler effect to measure the speed of cars by measuring the wavelength of pulses of radio waves reflected off of them. Techno-humanism, as author and Professor Yuval Noah Harari has termed the phrase, seeks to upgrade the human mind and give us access to unknown experiences and unfamiliar states of consciousness. However, revamping the human mind is an extremely complex and dangerous undertaking. We don't know how minds emerge, nor what their function is. Through trial and error, we are learning how to engineer mental states, but we seldom comprehend the full implications of such manipulations. Since we are unfamiliar with the full spectrum of mental states, we don't know what mental aims to set. If we think in terms of decades, then global warming, growing inequality, and the disruption of the job market loom large. Yet if we take the really grand view of life, all other problems and developments are overshadowed by three interlinked processes. 1. Science is converging on an all-encompassing dogma, which says that organisms are algorithms and life is data processing. 2. Intelligence is decoupling from consciousness. 3. Non-conscious but highly intelligent algorithms may soon know us better than we know ourselves. These three processes raise three key questions. 1. Are organisms really just algorithms? And is life really just data processing? 2. What's more valuable, intelligence or consciousness? And 3. What will happen to society, politics, and daily life when its non-conscious but highly intelligent algorithms know us better than we know ourselves? Steven Pinker states, "The mind is a system of organs of computation designed by natural selection to solve the kinds of problems our ancestors faced in their foraging way of life, in particular understanding and outmaneuvering objects, animals, plants, and other people." The summary can be unpacked into several claims. The mind is what the brain does. Specifically, the brain processes information, and thinking as a kind of computation. The mind is organized into modules or mental organs, each with a specialized design that makes it an expert in one arena of interaction with the world. The module's basic logic is specified by our genetic program. Their operation was shaped by natural selection to solve the problems of the hunting and gathering life led by our ancestors in most of our evolutionary history. The various problems for our ancestors are subtasks of one big problem of their genes, maximizing the number of copies that made it into the next generation. Complex structures such as stars, galaxies, and planets arise from sound waves in the primordial plasma. In producing these sounds, the universe functioned like an instrument. Noise is usually perceived as an unwanted signal, a sound to be eliminated. Good headphones are those that reduce noise. Unwanted noise happens even in science. Penzias and Wilson were desperate to get rid of the noise confusing their coveted radio signals. Ironically, the meaningless noise and they were struggling to get rid of was the cosmic microwave background radiation. We can understand how noise can arise using the Fourier idea. Simply add waves of all frequencies, each with the same amplitude, and we end up with a featureless white noise signal. Our ears will perceive this sound as a hiss because there's no one frequency that dominates. Each contributes to the sound equivalently, so white noise is actually the most democratic sound. Just like the visual system, the auditory system consists of a single brain area where the neural transformation of sound waves ends up. The primary auditory area, A1, which receives the auditory information from the ear, is situated in the upper part of the temporal lobe. Most of the area is within the lateral fissure and includes parts of Heschel's gyrus and the superior temporal gyrus. Just as the visual areas represent the visual input with retinotopic maps, the primary auditory context represents sounds with tonotopic maps. Depending on the frequencies of the sounds, different neurons of A1 become sensitive. The most anterior neurons respond to low frequencies. As the sound becomes higher and higher, more and more posterior areas of A1 are engaged. Processing the sound frequency is of crucial importance for perceiving played music and spoken words. A sound produced on a piano will have different properties from a sound made on a violin, but from their common frequency may classify them as the same note. Music requires fine differentiation between sounds, which in turn takes time. Slow, precise auditory processing typical of music is carried out in the right A1. Speech, in contrast, involves a very fast stream of stimuli that does not leave each time for precise differentiation. The left hemisphere is better equipped for the fast, crude auditory processing typical of speech. The triangular region posterior to A1, called the planum temporal, is an important language and auditory area. It also projects auditory information farther to the parietal lobe and later to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. In an obvious parallel with its visual counterpart, the dorsal auditory stream is responsible for locating sounds, an important skill for survival. The ventral stream forwards the information in the interior parts of the superior temporal gyrus. The neighboring inferior frontal gyrus is the final destination of the ventral stream. The ventral auditory system is responsible for the identification of stimuli in the case of sounds. The add one task. Start beating a steady rhythm, or better yet, set a metronome at 1 beat per second. Remove the blank card and read the 4 digits out loud. Wait for 2 beats, then report a string in which each of the original digits is incremented by 1 period. If the digits on the card are 5294. The correct response would be 6305. Keeping the rhythm is important. Few people can cope with more than 4 digits in the add 1 task, but if you want a harder challenge, please try add 3. One of Hess's findings had specially captured the attention of the late Daniel Kahneman. He noticed that the pupils are sensitive indicators of mental effort. They dilate substantially when people multiply 2-digit numbers, and they dilate more if the problems are hard than if they are easy. His observations indicated that the response to mental effort is distinct from emotional arousal. A brief overview of the physics in which we utilize to describe sound waves that will just be necessary for this particular discussion. There's much more information, more details, and more aspects available in the literature, but I believe this is accurate enough and concise enough really to serve the purpose of gaining a full, more robust understanding of sound in general. The speed of sound depends on the properties of the medium, such as the gas density. For air at room temperature, the speed of sound is approximately 343 meters per second. The speed is independent of the frequency of the sound wave and applies to both periodic waves, steady tones, and non-periodic waves, short clicks or beeps. Sound in a liquid or a solid also travels as longitudinal waves, with the displacements of the molecules in the liquid or solid being parallel to the propagation direction. The speed of sound is generally smallest for gases and highest for solids. It is also possible to have transverse waves in a solid. Longitudinal waves involve motion of atoms parallel to the direction of the wave, and such waves are therefore also called sound. In fact, when a sound wave from air impinges on a solid, a corresponding sound wave propagates into the solid. The speed of sound waves in a solid depends on the solid elastic properties, and sound travels faster in stiffer materials.